So what I want to do in this first video, starting looking at the existence of God, the various arguments for and against the existence of God, what I want to do in this first video is have a look at Christian understandings of God. I want to talk about the various different Christian beliefs, the various theological beliefs within different denominations of Christianity. And then I want to talk about the various beliefs about God's relationship with the world, God's relationship with humanity, and then ask some questions about why there really is this kind of distinction, this delineation in terms of the different belief systems. So we're going to start off with the introduction, and we're going to talk about just some of the basic things that different denominations of Christianity believe. So it's true that most Christians would accept the teaching of the Trinity. Now we know what the teaching of the Trinity is. It has a very complicated theological history, but the general basic definition is that God is seen as three. So God as three, and these are the Father, so the God Himself, and then the Son that is represented through Jesus, and then we have the Holy Spirit. This is the traditional Trinitarian belief about the Christian God. Now, not all Christians would accept this interpretation of the biblical text. So you have people like Unitarianism, which is not the same as utilitarianism. Okay, these are different things. Unitarianism is a Christian belief that God is one being, that they don't have this Trinitarian view. Utilitarianism is something different and is something to do with ethics. So we'll accept. So make sure you don't get mixed up between the two there. And it accepts that Jesus existed, of course. It accepts the existence of Jesus and the importance of Jesus' teachings in the New Testament. However, it accepts that He was in some way the Son of God, but not literally God Himself. So that's the distinction here. So we have that some Christian beliefs in the Trinity that Jesus was literally God. However, the Unitarianism believes that while Jesus was the Son of God, He was not literally God. You also have different beliefs around the teachings when it comes to Jehovah's Witnesses. They also reject the teaching of the Trinity. Okay, they argue that Jesus was created by Jehovah and is also not eternal. Okay, so has a beginning is one of the things that the Jehovah's Witness would believe. Has a beginning, and if they have a beginning, Jesus has a beginning. Therefore, Jesus cannot be eternal. Okay, the Son of God cannot be eternal. They also reject the idea that the Holy Spirit is some kind of separate thing from God, but rather that the Holy Spirit is seen as Jehovah's force going through, acting through certain acts. Okay. So again, this is a very a clear rejection of the Trinitarian view of Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. There are also other teachings and interpretations, especially when it comes to the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is of the three. The Holy Spirit is the one that has a lot of biblical interpretation and theological debate around. So we have the Nicene Creed, which teaches. The Nicene Creed teaches the Holy Spirit comes from both God as the Father and from God as the Son. Okay, but then we have the Eastern Orthodox tradition. The Eastern Orthodox tradition that the Holy Spirit comes from just the Father and not from the Son. Okay, so not from the Son, not from the Son, which is an interesting interpretation. And then you've also got the Orthodox Church maintaining that the Father is the source of all things. So as we can see here, there is a lot of different interpretations. So we have lots of different interpretations. Lots of different interpretations. And we're going to talk about why we have these different interpretations later on. But just to note that there are definitely differences of opinion in terms of the very specific details around the theological principles that come from biblical interpretation, and the church fathers and and the development of Christian thought throughout the last 2,000 years. Let's move on to talk about God's relationship with the world as seen in mainly through Genesis. Okay, so in the book of Genesis, it's outlined God's relationship with the world. That we've got here, we can underline. So in the book of Genesis, God speaks and causes things to come into existence. Now that's important. We'll go talk about that a little bit later on. And this illustrates the view that the world is somehow dependent on God for its existence. Okay, so if it wasn't for God, causing the world, causing creation, effectively reality, to come into existence, then it wouldn't have existed. That's the key takeaway, the key principle view that we see within the Bible. Okay, Christians believe that God's involvement in the world continues after creation as well. Okay, so they believe that not only did God create reality, but God is also immanent in his creation. He is involved in creation. So involved in creation. And most argued that God created the world ex nihilo, which means out of nothing. Okay, so it wasn't that there was there was matter beforehand that God used to craft into reality, but that he spoke, and the creation came from nothing. And this also further solidifies the notion that we've already talked about, that the world is dependent on God for its existence. So that's the view that we have here. God's relationship with people, with humanity, is a little bit different. It's a slightly more complicated because there's a few different interpretations to look at. So when we see God's relationship with humanity, we look at the very first book of Genesis 1, okay, and we see that God says, let us make man in our image, in our likeness. So that's Genesis 1:26, and this shows a very, very unique link that must be picked up on if you're thinking about the interpretation of biblical text. It shows a very unique link between God and humanity, okay, something that we don't see in other creatures that God created, because he is created in the image of God. So we are created in the image of God. Image of God. Now this is something that you don't see with other creation, so it shows a very specific connection between God and humanity. This connection is further solidified because God gave humanity stewardship and dominion over the rest of his creation. So this again sets humanity apart. So it sets us apart. Oops, we can't see that. I'm going to come down here. So it sets humanity apart from from other creation, because we are seen as above other creation. We are given dominion over the rest of his creation. Okay, and when God creates Adam in Genesis 2:7, he breathes life into his nostrils. So again, we have another a very clear link for between God and humanity, something that you can distinguish between this and with God and his other creation. And God's care for humanity doesn't just sit in Genesis 1. We also see it in the rest of the Bible. So with humanity is clearly seen when it comes to the incarnation. Okay, God maintains this relationship through the presence of the Holy Spirits in their lives. So we've got a very clear relationship between God and humanity that is found within Genesis and within the rest of the Bible. One thing that needs to be asked is the different kinds of Christian views on God's on God's creation and the relationship that God has with humanity and with the world. Okay, and it has been shown that the traditional view of the metaphysics of God, the sort of God's creation and God's role within the universe, has been challenged by some other Christian denominations. Okay, so the traditional view is that God is timeless, and he is the creator of everything, including time, and God is unlimited, and thus he is unchanging. Okay, so God is infinite. That is the general traditional view of God. However, this brings out a couple of paradoxical ideas when it comes to God's creation and the relationship with God's creation. If God was to be unchanging and is existing outside of creation, okay, and is timeless, how can God also at the same time be intimately involved within his creation? So this is the idea of God being immanent. So this is the idea of God being immanent. Okay, so this is the paradox of God's immanence and his transcendence. How can God be both transcendent, existing above and outside of creation, okay, but also immanent, existing within and through creation, and intimately involved within creation? And the general accepted view is that some people accept that God is unchanging and is transcendent and exists outside of creation. Others accept the view that God is immanent within creation. These are the kinds of paradoxical things that you will start to find when we start to look more and more at the nature of God's existence as well. Especially if you go up to A level and talk about the nature of God, there are a number of paradoxical philosophical things that really challenge the view that God can be all of the different things that are claimed of him at the same time without there being some kind of contradiction or paradox. But that's a little bit beyond the scope of GCSE, so we'll leave that as it is. So just as a final note, we've looked at the different denominations of Christian belief, especially around the teachings of the Trinity and the kind of interpretations of the Holy Spirit, just to show it as an example the kinds of disagreements that there can be within Christianity when looking at biblical interpretation. We've looked at God's relationship with the world, we've looked at God's relationship with humanity, and then we've looked at different views that challenge the traditional metaphysics of God's existence.